Hey folks, this is Kalani. We have a lot of class changes, buffs and nerfs coming through with the next weekly reset. Quite a few classes on top are getting knocked down a peg or two, and there are actually a lot of buffs for the lower performing specs to try and bring them up to par. There are also some very important tuning changes for trinkets, so you may not be chasing after that Arakara sack brood anymore, and the dev team are trying to figure out how to balance delves between solo players and groups, but it doesn't seem to be going all too smoothly. There's a lot to talk about, so let's break it all down. Now before we jump in, be sure to hit up that like button and subscribe so you never miss another video. Let's kick things off with those class changes, starting with the Death Knights. The Sand Lane hero talent tree has quite a few buffs. Vampiric Strike chance to trigger was buffed up to 25%, Frenzied Bloodthirst damage of Death Coil and Death Strike increased by 5% per stack, up from 4% per stack, Visceral Strength grants 8% strength, up from 6%, and for Blood specifically, Vampiric Strike damage was increased by 20%, and Infliction of Sorrow deals 15% of remaining damage over time, up from 10%. Demon Hunters don't have any specific buffs or nerfs, but they do have a lot of bug fixes for I-Beam which sound like they could be insanely impactful. I-Beam was dealing reduced damage beyond one target instead of 5, so that's been fixed and you can actually deal AoE damage now, and then there are 2 damage bonuses for I-Beam that weren't working properly, so they've been fixed as well. So hopefully I-Beam will be dealing a good chunk more damage with these fixes in place. Moving on to the Druids, Balance will be getting some much needed buffs again. I feel like they've been buffed quite a few times now, so hopefully this gets them to a good place. All ability damage has been increased by 6%, so a nice across the board buff to help bring up their overall damage, but then Star Surge damage has been increased by 16% on top of that, and Starfall damage has been increased by 20%, so those spenders should hit quite a bit harder with these buffs coming through. Elun's Chosen Lunar Calling damage bonus was also buffed up to 80% from 65%, so some big buffs for Balanced Druid going into next week. Feral wasn't left out this week though. Blood Talons and Lion Strength no longer increase the damage of Rampant Ferocity, so that change has been reverted from a previous week, but they're going to see a 3% buff across the board, a 6% damage buff to Rip, Ferocious Bite damage is up 3%, and Feral Frenzy damage was buffed up by 10%. Then Druid of the Claw's Ravage damage was increased by 3% as well, so hopefully this puts Feral in a better place next week. And it looks like almost all of the Druids are getting some love this week, as Resto is getting some nice buffs as well. They'll get an 8% healing buff across the board to all abilities, so that's going to be very useful, but then Wrath, Starfire and Star Surge damage are all being buffed up by 20%, so you can contribute more damage without having to worry about cat weaving. Evokers have a couple of quick buffs this week too. They'll get a 10% buff to Disintegrate damage for every spec, and then Devastation will also see a 10% buff to Eternity Surge, so not quite as crazy as those across the board buffs, but Disintegrate getting a buff should be impactful either way. Now it probably comes as no surprise that Arcane Mages will be getting nerfed yet again, though it could definitely be worse. Sun Fury Meteorite damage is being reduced by 15%, Burden of Power damage bonus is being reduced down to 20% from 30% for both Arcane Blast and Arcane Barrage. Note that these nerfs are only for Arcane, so Sun Fury remains unchanged for Fire. Speaking of Fire Mages, they're actually getting another round of buffs. They'll see a 6% damage boost across the board and a 25% buff for Living Bombs damage, so hopefully that will bring them back to the table. Arcane has been dominating quite comfortably so far in the expansion, so it would be fun to see Fire get enough buffs to start to compete. Next up we have the Monks, starting with Mistweaver. They're going to see a 3% buff to all of their healing, and then a 15% buff to their Tiger Palm and Rising Sun Kick damage. Not quite as impactful as that 8% Resto Druid buff, but it's better than nothing. Windwalkers will also see a small change to Darting Hurricane. Its trigger rate was reduced by 50%, and it reduces the global cooldown by half of its original amount. Moving on, we come to Paladins. Holy will see a 6% healing nerf across the board, but they will also be getting some huge damage buffs. 60% buffs to Judgment and Crusader Strike, and a 20% increase to Hammer of Wrath damage. Avenging Crusader's transfer amount was nerfed quite significantly though, from 420% to 260%, so that's going to take some playing around with, especially with the damage changes coming through. Holy Prism single target damage was buffed up by 100% though, with a 50% buff to its AoE damage, and then Retribution has a quick nerf to the Herald of the Sun hero talent tree. Dawnlight damage was reduced by 15%. Priests are going to see a quick 6% damage boost across the board for all of Shadow's spells and abilities, but Psychic Link will be reduced down to 25% of direct damage, down from 30%, so more damage overall, but less damage being contributed to your AoE. Rogues will be joining the nerf back crew this week, though it is only for Outlaw. They'll see a 4% damage nerf across the board, a further 10% damage reduction for dispatch damage, and melee auto attack damage will also be nerfed by 8%. There is some good news though, both their 2-set and 4-set bonuses were buffed up by quite a bit, so you're going to have less passive general power, but when you get your set bonuses equipped, you should start to feel a little bit stronger. Enhancement Shamans will be seeing some buffs heading into next week with an across the board 4% buff, so everything should be doing at least a little bit more damage. Witch Doctor's Ancestry will reduce the cooldown of Feral Spirit by 1 second instead of 2, and then the 2-set bonus was buffed up to 10% damage increases from 6%. Restoration will also see some buffs, but maybe not the kind you think. Lava Burst damage, Lightning Bolt damage, and Chain Lightning damage are all up by 12%, so at least you'll be doing a bit more damage while playing your healing Shaman. Warlocks haven't been left out of the fun either. For Demonology, Demon Bolt damage is up 20%, Pact of the Arid Ruin Doomguard damage is up 45%, and Felguard damage was increased by 15%. For Destruction, they'll see a 6% buff across the board, a further 40% damage increase for Dimensional Rift, and another 40% buff for Channel Demon Fire, so maybe those talents will actually see some use moving forward. And then we finally come to the Warriors. Colossus saw some quick buffs. Mountain of Muscle and Scars damage bonus was bumped up to 5%, and the damage of Demolish's 2 initial strikes was increased by 20%. Mountain Thane will also see a 6% buff to Thunder Blast, Lightning Strikes, and Ground Current, but Blade Storm damage has been reduced by 10% for both Arms and Fury. Fury will see a 15% nerf to Odin's Fury damage on top of that, but Strength of the Mountain was buffed up for Fury specifically, so Bloodthirst and Rampage damage will be increased by 20%, up from 15%. Now, all of these changes are scheduled to go live with the next weekly reset, which is Tuesday the 17th for NA servers. As Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus dungeons open up next week, I imagine we will see many more changes next week, so if your class didn't receive any attention in this round of changes, don't worry, it's not too late. Balance tuning will be ongoing for a little while at the very least. But what do you think of these buffs and nerfs? Are there any classes that you think really need to see some big changes either way to bring them in line? Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Now, we're also going to see quite a lot of buffs and nerfs to various trinkets in the current season, and a lot of these probably won't surprise you. A lot of popular trinkets like the Arakara Sackbrood and the Shadowbinding Ritual Knife or the Spymaster's Web, they've all been nerfed, while a lot of other trinkets that were previously not competing quite as well are getting some buffs. In some cases, they are quite substantial too. We have some 25%, 20%, and 15% buffs sprinkled throughout for plenty of these lower performing trinkets, so it's not just classes getting some tuning going into next week. So if you have one of these trinkets, or if they are on your best in slot list, I would double check those lists again on reset day just to make sure you're still chasing after the best gear. Moving on, something else that's been getting a lot of tuning changes are delves, and this has been a bit of a mess so far. If you played through some higher tiers of delves earlier in the week, you may have noticed that they were pretty difficult if you played through them solo, but if you were playing with other people, you may have found them incredibly easy, perhaps too easy. It seems like something was wrong with the group scaling, and delves were actually being made easier as you added more players instead of harder. Mobs would have less health and deal less damage when you added players in some cases, so that's a little weird, but the way in which group scaling worked in general just made it much easier to run delves as a full group of 5 when compared to running them by yourself. In response to that, Blizzard pushed a hotfix which basically just broke delves while in a group. Everything was one-shotting you, everything had a crazy amount of health, and it just became way too cumbersome to complete them while in a group. They also made tier 8 delves quite a bit harder by including the mini-bosses from later tiers, which led to a lot of folks resetting their delve run if they ran into one of these mini-bosses in an area they couldn't skip over easily. In some cases, if you couldn't skip the mini-bosses, your delve run was almost always bricked, which made the whole experience quite frustrating. Thankfully, the tuning changes didn't end there. The mini-bosses are now gone, banished back to the higher tiers, so you don't have to worry about that. Group scaling should work a bit better now, so you won't be getting totally wrecked anymore, but it's still going to be a lot harder than it was earlier in the week, and monsters are going to have a lot more health, making everything take much longer. Bran also seems to now kind of just pull whatever he wants sometimes and run off when he gets aggro, and I've seen a lot of talk about him dealing significantly less damage when compared to before, and while I haven't seen any specific update notes, I definitely feel like that might be the case. He also seems to take more damage and generally just die faster. There were times when Bran could carry your entire delve, and even some boss fights almost single-handedly, but that doesn't seem likely anymore. He just kinda dies too fast. Again, I haven't seen any official notes on this, so maybe it's the other scaling changes working in weird ways, but Bran feels less effective now as well. But there were also some targeted tuning changes to specific delves or bosses, so those should hopefully be a bit easier or more forgiving when you next venture into them. But this does leave us in a place where delves are quite a bit harder to progress through and complete when compared to the start of the season, and if you're trying to do these in a group, it's going to take quite a bit longer when compared to before. Solo players may have a little bit of an easier time now thanks to some of the delve-specific nerfs, but that's about it. Bran being a bit less effective is also going to impact the solo players even more, so keep that in mind. I'm curious to see where they go from here. It feels like delves were scaled in the wrong kind of way. If going up tiers just increases the damage of spells, unavoidable AoEs, and auto attacks from mobs, it's going to punish different classes and specs at distinctly different rates. I would have loved to see delves be more skill-based, where most spells and abilities were either skill shots or swirls on the floor that you could dodge. Throw in some small unavoidable damage to encourage things like self-heals, defensives, and maybe some extra utility options, sure, but have the vast majority of the difficulty come from dodging stuff, not cheesing and kiting the entire delve. The Plunderstorm combat would actually have worked perfectly here if monsters had those kinds of skill shots and abilities instead of web blasts that don't seem to have a cooldown and ignore line of sight and can be cast through walls. I feel like we wouldn't be running into these same kind of scaling problems. But what do you think of the delve changes from what you've experienced so far? Were you having more fun with delves before these changes or after them? And how difficult do you think delves should be? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon and to all of our members here on YouTube. You can see the names floating by on screen. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can find links in the description or click the join button just below the video. If you enjoyed the video or found it useful in any way, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you're always kept up to date. Thanks for watching, folks. Good luck and have fun, and as always, I'll see you next time.